Okay. Alright, so this is obviously a continuation of my last theory lecture, and I was hoping there would be less people here, and especially less new people here, about Lenin, or Althusser's Lenin and philosophy. I highly suggest that you look up this topic if you're interested in it on the RSU YouTube channel. Why you'd be interested in it, I don't know, but let's hope. However, I will recap a few key points for everyone, since it has been several weeks since I gave my original lecture. First, if you'll recall, the lecture focused around not Lenin's philosophy, but instead his relation to philosophy. In the same event, it focused not on the ideas of philosophy, but the very relation between philosophy and the sciences. Particularly, we looked at a few ways in which the two interact. Philosophy is in a unique position in which it is able to comment on the crises of science, and that when scientists find themselves in these positions and find themselves commenting on the crises, they have already slipped into what Althusser calls the history of philosophy. These shifts can change in science or can be in addition to science, often from the field of philosophy. Althusser also points out that the idea that the philosophy of something necessarily lags behind the science of that thing. And if that is the case, then Marx's philosophy must necessarily lag behind the science of history that Marx seems to have pioneered. Again, for more discussion on this, the other video covers it a lot better than I've covered it here. So Althusser, like I said, talks about Lenin's relationship to philosophy. He talks of Lenin's refusal to debate people who philosophize simply to expand fortunes of intelligence and subtlety for no other purpose than to ruminate in it. And he claimed that he did not philosophize like them, but instead practiced philosophy. And of course, we can look at Marx in the Thesis of Feuerbach, when he says that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. In other words, Lenin's philosophy is the philosophy of praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S. So at the end of my last lecture, I went with Althusser's quotes: "We surely owe the service and this homage to a man who was lucky enough to be born in a time for politics, but unfortunate enough to be born too early for philosophy. After all, who chooses his date of birth?" And if you'll recall, the very next section, Althusser recants his last line, and in a sense says that no one is ever born too early for philosophy. If philosophy lags behind, and if this lag is what makes it philosophy, how is it ever possible to lag behind a lag, which has no history? If we absolutely must go on talking of a lag, it is how we are lagging behind Lenin. Our lag is simply another name for a mistake, and we talked briefly about the different mistakes that have been made in this kind of lag last time. So moving on to my topic at hand, that being the second half of which Althusser switches, and instead of looking at Lenin in his relationship to philosophy, he begins to look at Lenin's great philosophical theses, or the philosophical position taken by Lenin, registered in philosophical pronouncements. Althusser begins by flat out stating that he is ignoring some of the more pressing concerns that involve Lenin's terminology and context. And while Althusser says that these could be content of any large study, he shrugs them off for now, as merely being situational. He breaks down Lenin's philosophy in a few different parts. The first are what Althusser labels as the three theses. There were more, of course, but Althusser is talking only about three, and only in terms of what he says are pronounced naked essentials. Jumping right in, Thesis 1, philosophy is not a science. Philosophy is distinct from the sciences. Philosophical categories are distinct from scientific concepts. Althusser points out why this is important and indicates the decisive point in which these theses become so important. The category of matter. Surely the touchstone for materialist philosophy, and Lenin says that the distinction between the philosophical category of matter and the scientific concept of matter is vital for Marx's philosophy. Althusser quotes from Materialism and Empirical-Criticism. Matter is a philosophical category. The sole property of matter, with whose recognition philosophical materialism is bound up, is the property of being an objective reality. Althusser states this conclusion much better than I could, so I'm going to read a lengthy quote from his book. It follows that the philosophical category of matter, which is conjointly a thesis of existence and a thesis of objectivity, can never be confused with the context of scientific concept of matter. The scientific concept of matter defines knowledge relative to the historical state of the sciences, about the object of those sciences. The content of the scientific concept of matter changes with this development, i.e. with a deepening of scientific knowledge. The meaning of the philosophical category of matter does not change, since it does not apply to any object of science, but affirms the objectivity of all scientific knowledge of an object. The category of matter cannot change. It is absolute. The consequences, which Lenin draws from this distinction, are crucial. Firstly, he reestablishes the truth, what was then called the crisis of physics. Physics is not in crisis, but in growth. Matter has not disappeared. The scientific concept of matter has changed. Let's see. And it will always go on changing in the future, for the process of knowledge is infinite in the object itself. So what does this mean for Lenin? Or if you were like me, what does this mean? Althusser draws from Lenin and perhaps puts words in his mouth when he looks at the defense of materialism against those who would propose its death at the time. And what Lenin's ideas Lenin's ideas have indeed defended materialism from those who would say that scientific crisis, in Lenin's case, the crisis of physics, does not destroy the philosophic concept of matter and materialism, but simply grows the knowledge of scientific matter, which, as Althusser said, will continue to change as our information grows. So the second thesis is if philosophy is distinct from the sciences, there is definitely a privileged link between philosophy and these sciences. This link is represented by materialist thesis of objectivity. Althusser, instead of showing what this thesis can mean to Lenin, he addresses more of what it caused Lenin to do. He cites a theoretical work of Lenin, saying, he, Lenin, speaks of scientific practice as a genuine practitioner. A reading of the text he devoted to Marx's Capital between 1898 and 1905, his analysis of the development of capitalism in Russia, both scientific works, you'll notice, show that his scientific practice as a Marxist theoretician of history, political economy, and sociology were constantly accompanied by an acute epistemological reflection. In other words, philosophy helping his study or his practice of science. Althusser goes on to compare this to a more concrete example of Lenin when he says, politically, Lenin is famous for his critique of spontaneism. I can never pronounce that word. Directed against political ideology, which, screened by an exaltation of the spontaneity of the masses, exploits it in order to divert it into incorrect politics. But it's not generally realized that Lenin adopts exactly the same position in his concept of science, scientific practice. Lenin wrote, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. Althusser says he could have just as equally have written, without scientific theory, there can be no production of scientific knowledge. Between the first two theses, Althusser stops to start a new list that we will come back to, but says here, the Lenin instance of affirming the privileged link between science and Marxist materialist philosophy is evidence that here we are dealing with a decisive nodal point, which he calls nodal point 1. He, and we will also return to these nodal points in the next section, but simply states here that a new list has begun and that we're looking for new relations. The third thesis goes back to what I talked about a lot in the first lecture, so I'm going to skim most of it here. But what Althusser says is that this is another thesis that Lenin seems to build upon from the ideals of Engels, when he says that philosophy comes down historically to idealism versus materialism, and that since this struggle is made of cut-and-paste arguments fitting the gaps that have been predetermined since the induction of philosophy, that philosophy is done, that as philosophy is currently done, it is inescapable from sophistry, and as Althusser says, it is the line of nothing repeating nothing. But it is not this idea that Althusser says that is what is important in the contribution of Lenin, because with just that, it is difficult to move forward. What Lenin does add, says Althusser, is his thought that the thesis that philosophy has no object, i.e. philosophy, is not to be explained merely by the relationship, or is to be explained merely by the relationship, is not to be explained merely by the relationship it maintains to the sciences. Ending on that note, Althusser steps into what he calls Lenin's practice of philosophy. And hopefully I can illuminate what I think is important in all this. That is, it is here that Althusser touches on the uses of philosophy through the practice of it. Instead of labeling it as a sophist struggle to maintain idealism over materialism or defense of materialism from idealism, Althusser claims there are times when Lenin is forced to define, at least somewhat, his philosophical practice and points to a few different sections of Lenin's work. I'll cover just the main one here. Lenin writes, again in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, "You will say that the distinction between relative and absolute truth is indefinite. I shall reply it is sufficiently indefinite to prevent science from becoming a dogma, in the bad sense of the term, from becoming something dead, frozen, or ossified. But at the same time, it is sufficiently definite to enable us to draw a dividing line. And the most empathetic and an irrevocable manner between ourselves and fideism and agnosticism, between ourselves and philosophical idealism and the sophistry that follows, that defines the sophistry of the followers of humankind. Also, so this philosophical practice has made a comment on the ability of science to continue and to be useful. Althusser writes, this function consists of drawing dividing lines between the theoretical domain, between ideas declared to be true and ideas declared to be false. Between the scientific and the ideological, the effects of this line are of two kinds. Positive, in that they assist a certain practice, scientific practice, and negative, in that they defend this practice against the dangers of certain ideological notions. Here are those of idealism and dogmatism. Such, at least, are the effects produced by Lenin's philosophical invention. Here we can see again Thesis 3 come to light. This drawing of a dividing line has two basic tendencies. It is a materialist philosophy that draws the dividing line in order to protect scientific practice against the assaults of idealist philosophy. Within this, we again see nodal point 1, the privileged relation between science and philosophy. We also see that we have taken back the original assertion that philosophy has no history, and instead we see that it can have a history, but nothing occurs in that history, as these dividing lines are obviously not literal lines, nor are they even lines of any sense, but gaps, i.e. emptiness of a distance taken. And because of this relation to science, these lines or gaps are always changing in order to fit the history of science. In other words, what we have, as Althusser puts it, is not a history of philosophy, but a history in philosophy. A history of the displacement of the indefinite repetition of null traces, these gaps, whose effects are real. As an example, Althusser says Hegel is also part of Lenin's philosophical practice. To read Hegel as a materialist is to draw dividing lines within him. So with this information, we can finally get to the second nodal point in our list. The first being the interesting and now fleshed out relationship between science and philosophy. Nodal point 2 continues from this idea that materialism and idealism are in constant struggle, and that since they are meant to draw these dividing lines in the history of science, as only the practice of philosophy can do, we then get what Althusser says is not class struggle, because Lenin does not say this, but Althusser does not say it would be disingenuous to Lenin to say that the division of philosophy represents class struggle, i.e. politics, and as such presupposes an instance in which politics is thus represented. This instance is the sciences, as Althusser puts it. Nodal point 1 is the relationship between science and philosophy. Nodal point 2 then is the relationship between philosophy and the politics, and that is everything revolves around this double relation. Althusser then draws this proposition from the nodal points. Philosophy is a certain continuation of politics in a certain domain. Philosophy represents politics in the domain of theory, or to be more precise, with the sciences of philosophy, represents scientificity in politics, with the classes engaged in class struggle. In other words, he is convinced that philosophy exists somewhere as a third instance between the two major instances which constitute it as itself an instance, the class struggle and the sciences. To finish, again because my own words are insufficient to explain eloquently or at all, the conclusion, I'll read another fairly lengthy passage from the book. He says, only with Lenin, then, could the prophetic sentence of the 11th Thesis of Feuerbach at last acquire body and meaning. Until now, philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Does this sentence promise a new philosophy? I do not think so. Philosophy will not be suppressed. Philosophy will remain philosophy. But knowing what is practice, or beginning to know it, it can be slowly transformed by this knowledge. Less than ever can we say that Marxism is a new philosophy, a philosophy of praxis. At the heart of Marxist theory, there's a science, a quite unique science, but science. What is new is Marxism's contribution to philosophy is the new practice of philosophy. Marxism is not a new philosophy of praxis, but a new practice of philosophy. This new practice of philosophy can transform philosophy, and in addition, it can, to some extent, assist in the transformation of the world. Assist only, for it is not theoreticians, scientists, or philosophers, nor is it men who make history, but the masses, i.e. the classes allied in a single class struggle. And that is how he ends his lecture on Lenin and his relation plus his philosophy. Hopefully that was somewhat coherent. That's all I have.
All right.
All right, I will do my best to answer questions, so.
What is idealism?
That's a hard thing to just give a straight definition for, since I'm not super into lots of philosophy. So maybe Chris could give a better answer.
You have a distinction between materialism and idealism. Materialism posits that there are material objects in the world. Idealism posits that we have an idea of a chair. Therefore, that's as far as we can get, is there's a chair. Because you can give, oh, it's a green chair, it has wood, right? You give the ideas that comprise the chair, but it breaks down once you take away all those ideas. So there's nothing past the ideas. Does that make sense?
Somewhat, yes.
Do you want to add anything to that? Possibly. I mean, it's sort of this conflicting idea of it's gone throughout.
At least as Max characterized Althusser's conception of materialism, right? It's an assertion that there is an objective world, and that there can be knowledge about it, right?
Yeah.
So what would be an idealism would be any form that rejects, in fact, either of those two propositions, which is one, there is not an objective world, which was actually the position of the critico-empiricists, the term critics, yeah. Their position was there's not, in fact, an objective world as such, but rather there's only sensation that we have of the world. So it's not an objective world, it's a subjective world, right? Because it's only through our subject experience of sensation that we come to know the world. And then the second form is a form of skepticism, which is you could posit that there's an objective world, but that we can't know about it. So one of the good tacts to take for this is skepticism. Like you hear people, basically anyone whose entire philosophy, and it's usually not philosophers who engage in skepticism, because that's a dead end. It's usually politicians or other individuals. Well, how can you really know that capitalism is exploitive? How can you really know that we're in Iraq for bad reasons, right? And so it becomes a skepticism such that you can never know anything about the world, right? To assert anything is to say, oh, well, that's sort of your opinion on it, you know, or maybe we all share a pretty common opinion on it, but it's still only opinion, right? So in this case, either rejecting either of those terms, an objective world or that it can be known, falls ultimately into idealism.
Gotcha. What are some examples of idealist philosophers?
Berkeley is a good example. Again, he basically posits that the way we know things, if I want to describe this pen, like I describe it as its form, its shape, the colors that it exhibits, like how I can use it. But these are the ideas that comprise the pen, right? If you take away all the ideas I have about the pen, what's left over? Like, how can you talk about something beyond the ideas of it? So Berkeley sort of goes in that direction and holds everything together through. He basically posits that essence is perception. Perception is essence. So what I can perceive of something is what I know of it. However, what I perceive as ideas, not necessarily that it exists in a material, objective way. Kant is also an idealist. Hegel's an idealist.
So the idea that perception is reality would that be an idealist sort of view?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to note that Hegel is an idealist to a certain extent, but also Lenin, along with, as Max was saying, Althusser, have a more complicated relationship with Hegel, as do most dialectical materialists. And the complicated relationship lies in this. For Hegel, right, it's about an objective world of which you can know things. Well, for Hegel, there's a dialectic whereby the objective world is merely a front for a subject, the absolute, right? But this very form of interplay, right, is itself dialectical. So there is, to a certain extent, a materialist core in Hegel that undercuts his idealism. Which I kind of got that sense you were talking about it.
He mentions Hegel like literally that one time in this essay. So when he's just mentioning Lenin, talking about Marx, talking about Hegel. So.
Okay.
Did you have something to say, Josh? Okay.
So could you further analyze the interplay between the relative truth and absolute truth, and what the implications that those have for politics?
Sure. So as he was essentially saying that this idea that philosophy as a materialist idea can draw the line, allows us to both view science as something that, let's see, he didn't actually use the word useful, but it seems to me that he's saying almost useful, because without this materialist idea, everything's idealism, we have to be skeptical of everything. So I think you can, and as he calls politics, or the science of politics essentially, I think you can draw the same line, that if we use this materialist concept, we can actually know things about politics in the scientific term, while not being dogmatic, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum. So the materialism kind of prevents it from going to dogmatism, but obviously there's always that skeptical element to it. And I think it's the exact same way in sciences as it is in politics, and that's the point of this, of what he's kind of trying to say.
To what extent does the very creation of the line of demarcation have to deal with the political struggle as such?
Let's see.
Does that question make sense?
Probably, but not to me so much. Maybe try one more time.
So what happens, right, is, I'm sorry, I'm using the term from what is to be done, right? But you've mentioned several times, it's about drawing a distinction
Right, yeah.
between idealism and materialism, between, you know, science and philosophy. So it seems that the very act of drawing a line of demarcation is important.
Right.
So to what extent does that line of demarcation play in politics as such, either for Althusser or for Lenin's, or Althusser's read of Lenin?
So if you're drawing this line of demarcation, then obviously you're looking at it from a materialist sense, because as Althusser says, only the materialists are drawing these lines as an almost defense against the idealist, right? So this line, I mean, as soon as you're drawing this line, you're immediately making it, at least to some extent, a struggle. And I think at one point he mentioned Marx's idea of the ideological class struggle, and perhaps this could be something along the lines of that, where the very simple fact that you're drawing these lines of demarcation within, say, the science of philosophy, the science of politics, could be related directly to class struggle, to actual physical class struggle, because it's within politics, which Althusser literally, says politics, class struggle. So I don't know if that made sense, or if that answered your question at all.
So what is the radical, so do you see Althusser's understanding of Marx's critique of philosophy, right, on the poverty of philosophy? Do you see that, or on the 11th thesis of Feuerbach, do you see that as a radical interpretation of Marx? Do you see that as going contrary to previous understandings of Marx on that thesis?
In that subject, he seems to mostly be talking directly about Lenin, and I think that Lenin did change Marx in a way that, in another essay of Althusser, he calls Lenin, Lenin is the philosopher of the Marxist science. I mean, there's in this essay as well. So obviously, as soon as you begin to do science to a philosophy, or to do philosophy to a science, it changes it radically. And so this is just kind of this relation they have. So I think the very fact that as soon as Lenin starts looking at Marx in this way, he's going to change a lot of things. And I don't think it's incredibly radical, but it's something that you couldn't have had without Lenin's version of the practice of philosophy towards Marxism.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Okay, well, let's thank Max.